Well, political theology is a term that kind of comes of age a little bit in the 20th century German context post World War II. So Jürgen Moltmann, Johann Baptist Metz, and Dorothy Zola kind of come up with an idea of political theology, which was to address the stagnancy of Protestant theology that ended up being co-opted pretty easily by the Third Reich government. Okay, so they wanted to essentially what the three of these individuals wanted to do was find a way to talk about theology that impacted and influenced theology on the ground in ethical format. It's not a term. Dorothy Zola actually ditches the term altogether. So I don't really, I use political theology. Actually, I use political ethics as part of my field of study. I don't say political theology. There is a political theology network. They probably would like to keep using the word, the term. But it's mostly about theology that inspires our political activity. The better way of talking about it, and this I follow closely with Dorothy Zola, is liberation theology. But liberation theology, when encountered as someone like me, who's a cishet white middle class person, I mustn't see myself the one being liberated by liberation theology. I need to see myself as the one who must resist the narratives that work to oppress people. So political theology, not political theology, liberation theology for me is a theology of resistance, which means resistance starts first with myself and then against the system on behalf of my neighbor to the glory of God. So it's something that Dirty Zola kind of cultivates. She ends up kind of leaving the whole thing really stressing, she's a real big proponent of liberation theology. But I think her strongest work is when she's addressing her audience, which are people who look like me. And she is advocating on behalf of the queer community in the 70s and 80s, which is pretty early. She's advocating on behalf of Black and Brown people, people of color in general, Indigenous. So she really wants to break down she wants to essentially push Rudolf Bultmann's project of demythologizing, Jean Marc. This one's for you, into the realm of the political. So where Boltman sort of isn't doesn't actually turn the project of demythologizing against his own time and context. He uses it principally in regards to getting at the kerygma, the kernel, the gospel, the thing that causes provokes faith, and the Bible and theology and sort of the spiritual realm, but he doesn't have necessarily the capacity to turn it on his political contextual experience or on himself necessarily. So that's what Dorothy Zola, who is considers herself to be a granddaughter of Bultmann, and in fact they have letters calling each other those familial terms. Very, very close relationship, but she pushes it because she sees the gospel as liberative. In a real, physical, tangible way, and not just in this spiritual way. And so she takes the project of demythologizing, pushes it into the public realm, and then says that essentially when we encounter Jesus in the Gospels, we should see him as a historical person who is confronting the powers, the political powers of his day, which is what gets him crucified, right? Um, and she says that I, as the reader of the Bible, should be questioning my own relationship with the structure of power in my own context and time, so that liberation can be more than just sort of this saccharine, elusive, I'm I've been forgiven my sins, right? Like, what does that mean if it doesn't have like a real tangible context in the political realm, the public sphere? So It's weird. Political theology is probably not a term that I tend to dabble in too much anymore, but mostly I like to look at theology of resistance, which is a manifestation of liberation theology that is wired towards demythologizing the person who identifies or participates in the dominant culture, who can identify with the majority of people in the dominant culture.
Can we
So,
talk about demythologizing for a second and just kind of like
sure.
put a definition on it and what
Ah,
exactly that looks like in practice?
I wish my second screen was working here because I'm literally going to be teaching on this. Um, Let me just do a quick tab over to, oh shoot, and now it's over there. It's actually not going to give it to me. Oh, what I'm trying to do is I have a second screen and it's gone. Okay, there we go. Now maybe I can access it. I literally have a definition here straight from one of Boltmann's texts. Oh no, okay, so it's still. It's back. Okay. I was just about to get it. So this is the text that I used. Jesus Christ in Mythology. He provides a really great definition. I'm actually teaching on demythology, the project of demythologizing, this coming Tuesday. So I want to get a good quote from him. Formal definition from Rudolf Boltmann's Jesus Christ in Mythology. There's other texts that are pretty good. Kerygma and the Myth. Okay. Um, my Zoom thought I was giving a thumbs up. Anyway, so this is what Bultmann writes. What shall we retain the ethical preaching of Jesus and abandon his eschatological preaching? Shall we reduce his preaching of the kingdom of God to the so-called social gospel? You see how he's already sort of attacking that idea of that social component. Or is there a third possibility? I'm thinking there is a third possibility, right? We must ask whether the eschatological preaching and the mythological sayings as a whole contains still deeper meaning, which is concealed under the cover of mythology. So, demythologizing, the project of, is getting at, so pulling back almost like a made bed. Right. In order to get in the bed, you have to take off all the, all the pretty pillows and the unuseful pillows. You have to pull all that stuff back. Then you have to pull back the covers, right? And then you get in. And so that's what essentially demythologizing is doing, is almost as if you're pulling back those layers so that you can get at the core of what the thing is. Hard-boiled egg would be another example of demythologizing. Like, to get at that yolk, you have to peel back the hard shell and get at the white, right? So that the covers, that these mythologies and the text are covering up the core. All right. So, if that is so, let us abandon the mythological conceptions precisely because we want to retain their deeper meaning. This method of interpretation of the New Testament, which tries to recover the deeper meaning behind the mythological conception, I call demythologizing. An unsatisfactory word, to be sure, which is funny because it becomes the word. Um, its aim is not to eliminate mythological statements, but to interpret them. It is a method of hermeneutics, meaning a way of reading the Bible, right? So he says, I'm trying to find the handle on my chair. He says that it's not about getting rid of the myth, though that's where some schools of thought following Bultmann go. And Zolad takes a big issue with that. And I'm always trying to find a good word for her work. It's I want to call it neo-mythologizing, in a sense that the liberated person should be able to then come back into encounter with the myth and not have an allergic reaction to it, but actually be able to allow the myth to continually expose the person's inner world. So I think that I'm not a Boltmann scholar, but I think that considering the closeness of Boltmann and Zola, I do think that she does really well by him and is a good interpreter of what he's doing, and completes his work. I think her political theology, this text, which was written before she got into liberation theology, she this I think this shows how far the actual project of demythologizing can go. right? I think she does a really good job showing that the actual inner workings of the project of demythologizing are broader than originally conceived. So she does a really good job there. But yeah, that should be a pretty good explanation of what
Yeah.
demythologizing is
Thank you.
as a
And it
non-Boltzmann
got me
scholar.
it, it got me thinking too. So when you're talking about like digging deeper and at surface level, I'm thinking about like the text in which we read, but then
Mhm.
as I'm thinking about it further, I'm thinking of all the stories in which we add onto the text that we read. And so like socially, as we're in groups, regardless of which religion or stories that we're kind of coming around, we kind of add context and layers onto that. And so by diving deep into that, by uncovering, it's also like this self uncovering to see what layers not only you have had a part in building, but that you have inherited for the
Yeah.
system in which you
Yeah.
come into. Is that, does that sound like the right track in
Yes,
which?
that's yeah, that's where I'm going with how I'm working well. And because of what I want to couple in there, if we're going to talk about demythologizing, we have to talk about deconstruction. And these two terms work together. So demythologizing would be that external sort of like I'm the subject, the object, I'm demythologizing. So Zola's going to push the project of demythologizing into the world where I now criticize my own socio-political context, strip back some of those things that I've been handed down, the aspects of white supremacy that are insidious, like questioning the role of heteronormativity. Why does marriage have to look a certain way, or why like posing questions under attack here also are things like created orders. Sometimes you'll hear a lot about that, specifically if you're a student of German theology in the 20th century, early to mid 20th century. Created orders is a big thing, like there's a certain inherent order to the universe, and the world and how it runs. And so we just the salvation systems, whether it's salvation from this in the spiritual realm or salvation within the temporal realm, always seem to somehow default to the created orders. So a woman who comes in contact with the gospel message is liberated to be a really good wife. It's always a
Imagine that.
it's always a truncated message. So, but one of the things that where the project of demythologizing, whether it's in the spiritual realm or in the temporal realm, I'm using that language straight from Martin Luther, and his understanding of the Reichs, the realms of God, and the world. The problem is that nowhere necessarily, I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but why I want to say demythology and deconstruction, because deconstruction is a personal. I deconstruct. I get angry. I rip apart the narratives that have formed me, right? I'm not just saying, oh, that's bad over there, and that's bad over there, and that's bad. But I need to turn that analytical gaze, that introspective, that thing that's analyzing and tearing apart. I need to bring it inside because I have been fueled by these narratives and I need to come apart. And so this just folds really well into that Protestant doctrine of justification by faith alone that Luther really sort of promotes a bunch in the beginning of that reformational period. But that the part of being justified by faith alone is being sort of crushed by the law, putting it in quotes there, because I don't necessarily think it's just God's law that does that, but just like the law of our world. Think about our capitalist informed, capitalist inspired, capitalist driven world. We're all desperate to find irreplaceability and unique identity, and we try to find it in our works, right? And so we're spinning this hamster wheel, trying to find it in our works, and we need to be destroyed. That idea, that pursuit needs to be destroyed. I have to stop believing it in myself. And so deconstruction becomes a really beautiful, beautiful process. But the risk of demythology, the project of demythologizing, and the risk of deconstruction is that they themselves can only diagnose the problems. There's no solutions offered. right? So the risk would be that unending, and I've heard this sort of articulated in modern concepts of deconstruction and projects of demythologizing, where you're almost just never sure of anything. Okay. And I don't think that's healthy. We need to allow our feet to land on solid ground, even if 2 years down the road, we're going to question that solid ground once again, right? But at
Yeah.
some point, we have to fall on firm foundation. Dorothy Zola has an excellent book called, which is really, it seems, I want to say axiomat or unaxiomat, I don't remember. It seems out of character, let's say, for her, because she's definitely not about fundamentalism or believe this or die. But she has this text called The Truth is Concrete. And she anchors truth in Christ, but not in such a way that it can't ever be challenged or changed or manifest differently, but that Christ is truth. And for every generation, Christ is truth. And now that truth might look a little bit different, but if it's constantly being thread through that narrative of Christ, in how Christ represents God into the world and how Christ represents humanity, in the throne room of God, if you will, then it's always going to take on, Christ is always going to be advocate of the oppressed. In 2025, that looks like advocating for migrant laborers, right? Where maybe in 1925, that looked like advocating for the Jewish community in Germany,
Yeah.
right? So that truth, she anchors it in Christ, and by anchoring truth in Christ, then you have a flexible, concrete truth. Um, it's a little bit, what is it when things contradict each other? Um, what word am I thinking of? Well, contradictory would be the word, one of the words, but there's another word that I'm thinking of, that is not coming to mind right now. But it's a concrete truth in the person of Christ,
Well, and I
which
feel like that might be also too, depending on your perspective, right? Because truth is based on perspective and which truth that you live. And so if I were in a different position of what truth would look like, Christ-centered, that could be really dangerous because you could mobilize a lot of people on a truth.
yeah,
And maybe that truth was the other side of truth, which is like fear, right? And so there is a truth in that, but it is also fueled by something a little bit different that I think that you're talking about, which could be really dangerous. And I think what we're seeing a lot today, and I mean throughout history, really.
yeah, yeah, and that's people sometimes when I'm teaching on some of this, because the idea of that we all have our own truth is a very prominent postmodern idea, right? And truth is relative. Um, all things are relative except for that statement, right? Like we can get into that kind of discussion.
Yeah.
Um, but it's not up for debate ever, according to the truth that Jesus articulates into the world, love, life, and liberation. Those are concrete. Those are concrete expressions of the truth that God demonstrates through Christ for Christians. So but the way that works out in everyone's life can look different. But love, life, and liberation are kind of concrete expressions of the truth that Jesus brings through his life, death, resurrection, and ascension. Um, you know what I'm saying? So like it's this weird, flexible, concreteness.
I think that too, like through the demythologizing project, you talked earlier about like these charismatic moments, right? This breakthrough of the message, or Paul Tillich might call it a conversion experience, no matter what that looks
Yeah.
like. And it's like when you pull back the layers, especially in our world that is becoming less and less church oriented,
Hmm.
you allow for these breakthroughs through this divine moment to happen. This this aha moment that you wouldn't have had because we are so far removed from 2000 years ago when this is being written. We don't have the cultural context that the average person does not have the cultural context or the understanding of the concept of hermeneutics, right? Or all these tools that are in our toolbox as theologians and as pastors. And so when we do that work for the people that we present to, we make that moment easier to break through time and space, um, which kind of, especially in a liberative context, can inform how we start to move differently through the world around us. And I guess that comes a good question. Like you talked earlier about um, this pushback against like this Protestantism, and Protestantism kind of became, instead of being as active within the community, there was this turning in on the self where we have this self-improvement ethic. We have this self-development, and we are identified with our church communities more, but our physical greater communities less. And so, like, do you have any idea what that looks like today for churches to, in this moment, especially in this historical moment, how do they reorient themselves to confront like the empire right now? How do we encourage those breakthrough moments, I guess?
I was sort of preaching on that this morning, specifically for my context, which is an avowed Christian context, specifically a Protestant expression of that Christian context. I think that we need to, I think we've been exposed that we have jettisoned the proclamation of Christ crucified and raised because for one good reason, which is the way it's been used historically to force conversion, right? Like that you have to believe this very certain thing. People have deconstructed and demythologized their way out of that word. But one of the things that the Christian, you think about the Gospel of Mark, okay, which is a very politically polemical gospel. Mark 1:1 literally opens up with the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now, for a lot of us, that just sounds religious. But Mark was making a very political statement because the sons of the Caesars themselves were the sons of God. So Mark was making a political statement with this very spiritual announcement. Okay, the Son of God has been born, and the Son of God's name is Jesus Christ. And here's the good news about this person. When the Christian church jettisons the proclamation of Christ, it loses its space, it loses its voice, it loses its power and authority to say anything into the world, because the only other option is to adopt the language of the kingdom of humanity, which now are just in an echo chamber. Okay, so even if we're espousing comforting news, it may not be different than what you would get anywhere else. And for a long time, for a couple of decades, that's been great. But I think right now what it's exposing is that the church has lost its ability to confront the temporal powers the way that it is historically been empowered to do. When we say, "Behold the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God," that we should get attention from the temporal realm, a "what the hell" reaction. Right now we get a new faith office in the White House. That's not, no, 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 no. We don't want that. We want our proclamation to be something different, something that cuts through the kingdom of humanity, that can parse out the bullshit, that can cut through the crap, right? And get to the heart of the matter, which is always love, life, and liberation. God's divine revolution of love, life, and liberation in the world, right? But we can't do that if we are deeply invested in language that's acceptable to the kingdom of humanity. So this morning we were assigned 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul's going on about the resurrection, something that our scientific post-enlightened minds have dismissed. I'm not saying that that's a bad idea. Maybe we should question it. But without the resurrection of Jesus, there is no church. It's why in the formal Protestant traditions on Maundy Thursday, the Thursday before Good Friday, you have a stripping down of the church. everything comes down, everything leaves the sanctuary, and it is bare wood. There's nothing there because the church doesn't exist in just the death of Christ. But specifically, it starts to exist the morning Jesus is resurrected and Mary encounters the empty tomb and is sent to go tell. That is the moment the church is born into the world. This going and telling the good news that Jesus Christ has been raised from the dead, right? That's the proclamation of the church. Now, can we engage with it from our postmodern, post-enlightenment, scientific experiences as people in 2025? Yes, absolutely. We don't need to just believe it like it's formal dogmatic doctrine, but we need to engage with it. That's what I like about what Zola does. She demythologizes and then does it in a way where you want to come back around and engage with that myth. What does it mean for Jesus to be resurrected? What does it mean to encounter the resurrected Jesus? What does it mean to proclaim, to run back to the disciples who were hiding and say, I was confronted. I think it's the Gospel of John that actually has the interaction with Jesus and Mary in the garden. Like, what does that mean for us? And that's where I believe that the church needs to kind of retrieve that story, as awkward as it is for our scientific minds, our intellectual minds, and I don't know, dare to preach it. What does that look like to preach a resurrection gospel, which is the foundation and substance of the church?
Well, and I think that, and correct me if I'm way off base, but this death of Christ really can be seen as it's stepping into this new, well, at least for like American Christian fascism, it's it's like the death of something, and then you hear these voices underneath that is like the resurrection of what it began as, not as what we're trying to portray it as. Even what am I trying to say here? Um, so like you have like these two sections of Christianity, right? You have this American Western fascist, very nationalistic belief structure. And then you have a lot of other groups that are very different, but they're also saying kind of the same thing that you're saying, right? That there is this greater truth, underlying truth. And if your gospel comes back to the rules of man, or like the I'm trying to say this through the lens, just for some background. I have never read the Bible. I am not a
Mhm.
Christian person. I'm a pagan person. I come from very outside. I listen to John Marc sometimes when they speak, but I have very limited theological understanding. And so to me, the this resurgence of liberation
Mhm.
is like the my brain keeps wanting to say rebirth, but that's not correct. It's why is the word gone from my brain now?
Oh,
Resurrection.
yeah.
And what that looks like, especially like when we have communities that are one, have a lot of religious trauma, or two, don't know how to hear through the lenses that they've been given.
Mhm.
And because it's a very dangerous thing, right? If you live in a community and you live around people and you're kind of segmented off into your own world and this is all you've heard for your whole life, like it's never easy to step out of that and
Mhm.
to see differently. And so I guess my question would be, how do you do that as a person in your position without also giving into, I know a lot of people who are like MAGA supporters, a lot of my family, a lot of people I grew up with, there is this anti intellectual piece that comes in. And so when we use big words and we use these big themes that aren't really accessible, it
Mhm.
almost puts a nail in your coffin again,
Mhm.
because even the words that you're trying to give people aren't hitting because there's already a blockade up. And so how do we like kind of bring that down a little bit?
Mm. Um, I think about that a lot. I think the first step is always in listening, 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 listening. So that's the first step, second step, third step, fourth step. Listen, 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 listen. At some point, you will hear an invitation to communicate into what you're hearing. I think a lot of times what we try to do is you try to go face to face with truth and truth, right? What the American evangelical Christian community believes is very real. And
Yes.
it is an interpretation out of the gospel. Sometimes we say, oh, that's just not real Christianity. It's Christianity. Okay, like you can get there from here. But one of the things that I find never works is going head to head and trying to argue. Hold on one second. I'm going to see if someone can take care of that dog. There's four other people in my house, so someone got her.
I understand.
We have roofers, so they are working on our roof. So we are the dog was not happy about it. Anyway, but that's we can't look at it as if we are going to go head to head and one truth is going to end up being superior to another because that's not really the point. The point is if you're actually going to live this in a moment where you're trying to break down a wall that's creating an inability to hear something different, you have to play the long game. There's no sweet and short, cut through that's just going to here, do these things, and you'll always win the person over. That's not the point. You always have to keep the person. It's not about getting people over to your side because that's using people as a means to an end. And the end is you being right. The goal is to always keep the person in front of you as a person and listen long enough that you find not even you, I would say, as a Christian pastor, where the Holy Spirit finds a way for you to enter in to communication. When we take it on our own, we tend to beat people up. And you can see this all throughout church history. When we decide that people have to believe a certain way or a certain thing, um, we we tend to become very abusive. But in my understanding as a Protestant Christian, when the Holy Spirit does it, it becomes a completely different thing. And so we have to always present ourselves as vehicles for the Holy Spirit to speak in kindness. I didn't say niceness, in kindness, with mercy and understanding. I think most of us have probably deconstructed and demythologized our way out of traditionalist conceptions of something, right? We know, we understand, right? And so having that compassion is really, really key. There isn't a solution. I think that there is something to be said for constantly speaking love, life, and liberation and doing it in a kind, merciful way that is like water eroding stone and showing up and actually acting the words that you're speaking, which is something that the Christian church has had a real difficult time with. And something that I've learned a lot actually from being in encounters with Gen Z. Okay. They'll call you out on your bullshit as fast as possible. And when I had the honor of teaching private high school, private Episcopal school, religion, and theology, um, I learned how important it was that if I was going to preach something or teach something, that they could see it in my life. And that alignment will speak way more than any of us with the best arguments or the best examples. So being willing, if you can be, if it's safe, intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, physically safe for you to be in the presence with someone that disagrees with you, or sees things differently, I recommend showing up as much as you can. Not, I mean, not always like showing up intentionally, but like not running away from those circumstances. But again, I really emphasize because some of us have come out of situations where those people aren't safe. And so leave them to
Yeah.
God, brush the dust off your sandals, and let some other prophet come along. Um, God wishes
We're-
for all people to be saved. Okay, I'm putting that in quotes. So if it's not through you, it could be through someone else, you know?
I
So,
like that perspective that like you don't have to be the one
yeah.
because I feel like as I mean white supremacy culture demands too, white saviorism, right? We think that we're going to save everybody
Mhm.
and our way, and that also goes for left or liberal spaces. It doesn't just have to come from the right. And I think that sometimes we forget that. I can give a great example. At my space in which I go to church, we had a sermon where we talked about the Great Samaritan. I go to UU space. We are not Christian centered at all, but unfortunately, it was used to talk about. It was very funny that chose someone with a red hat as the Good Samaritan, as the enemy of the state, as the person, the antithesis of.
Mhm.
And some of the people clapped in the congregation, and I laughed because I don't think that they understood fully what that means. Is that in putting that person in that position, you're also seeing the humanity in that person,
Yeah.
right? It does not mean that you are above or better than. It just means there is kindness in places that you may not see it because we all have our own biases. We look through our own lenses, and it doesn't mean that someone is exactly who we think that they are.
Mhm. Mhm.
And John Mark does a lot, talks about this a lot about finding what's at stake for somebody else. And then I think in doing that, not only do we humanize them, but we can humanize ourselves in that situation
Yes.
because it's very, very easy to be the bully. It's very, very easy to be in a position of moral or intellectual superiority.
Yes. I really agree with that. I really like the way that you phrased that. It is easier. It's as easy for us to be bullies as it is for anyone else to be bullies. And honestly, one of the most in a world that is thriving off of practices that are unhumane, revolutionary language begins with speaking humanity back into the world, right? Where the world is unmerciful, revolutionary language articulates the merciful. And so that's that essentially, I think is the core of the message of what Jesus is telling us about who God is through the Gospels, and how we are supposed to be in the world, especially when confronted with people who hate us. Um, and yeah, that's really,
And I think it's a really interesting intersection to kind of stand in because on one hand, you have to humanize the person across the table, and in the other, you have to set your own boundaries and understand that
Mhm.
one, every conversation doesn't have to end in total chaos and destruction or
Yeah.
agreement.
Mhm.
It's definitely a yes and, right? And to occupy a space of unknowing, I think is really uncomfortable for anyone.
Yes, it
And
is.
it generates a lot of fear.
It
And I think
does.
that we also have to remember that the person across the table is also probably feeling those same things.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, but also there is also the point of like justice.
Hmm.
So how do we bring justice in
Hmm.
without losing our own or someone else's humanity
Hmm.
in the process?
Hmm. Um, well, that justice technically, when done right, shouldn't take humanity from anyone. Um, Justice, when we think about the way that God defines that, at least in the scripture, we see that how Jesus kind of represents what justice looks like. It looks like, the liberation of the oppressed, the giving of food to the hungry, like the hungry are satisfied, the thirsty are satisfied. And justice looks like mercy. Justice is the foundation of peace, and so there's these things, they're not manufactured through militarization of our police force or bringing the, weaponization of the military into our country to cause conformity or to stockpile weapons so deep. I should go this way, so deep that we think we're safe from threat from the outside. But actual equity, mercy, love, these things work to maintain everyone's humanity. Any conversation about that demands the stripping of humanity and dignity from another human being, that is not justice. It just can't be. At least not the way that I understand it as a Christian, as a Christian scholar and as a ethicist and as a priest. Justice has a very specific form for me. But it doesn't mean that I need to now strip the humanity off of someone who disagrees with me. And as I said before, like sometimes articulating human-heartedness, to quote Confucius, actually being human-hearted in a world that is demanding everyone to not be is revolutionary. And you know, um, and the desire to squash that, to be inhuman, is the counter-revolution, right? Um, so,
I like thinking about this too because when we think about the last few decades, I mean, even the inception of just like the creation of America in general, we really have this container that does not, like for me as a teacher, and just like you said, I'm gonna live what I teach, not just teach it. And
mhm,
so if we're always getting echoes back from our society of violence and what we may not perceive as injustice because we've been told differently, but it most definitely is. And we believe that the justice that we're imposing on someone else is righteous
mhm,
because that is what we have been given our whole life. That's like what we've like reflected within our society. It's what we've been taught. And so like the breaking down of that viewpoint is coming back to like the deconstruction. Like that deconstruction doesn't just happen in religion. It also
right.
happens within
Yep,
societies and
yep.
it also happens in social circles.
Mhm.
But yeah.
I think one thing that you use the word righteous. Righteous is a really awesome word that is misused all the time.
Mhm.
So righteous means right relationship. When we think about the Hebrew Bible and we go back, it's about being in covenant. It's about the humanization of the other. And a lot of times we think about righteous anger that comes from a narrow concept of God. So, like when we think about the evangelical space versus the Magnificat, so Mary says, "My soul magnifies the Lord." In a lot of cases, we have these dehumanizing theologies that shrink the Lord, right? But and those still occupy this type of idea of righteousness. But the right relationship goes against what Lauren's been saying, this love, life, and liberation, right? And so I think. I think about Paulo Freire and Pedagogy of the Oppressed when I think about humanization a lot because Freire wanted to show the oppressed that they were human, they deserved a better life around them. But he also says, but we have to look at the oppressor because they deserve humanization too.
Mhm. Yeah.
And they are alienating themselves. Tillich uses this language of alienation, this separation, this estrangement from each other. And so righteousness and the idea of this almost credo, this love, life, and liberation is this end of estrangement, this radical humanization. And it's just incredibly hard sometimes, especially like when because it's not just the neighbor that we have a disagreement with, it's the person who occupies the White House,
Mhm.
right? It takes a lot of work to humanize the who we see as the rulers of the darkness of this age, right? These powers and principalities about us.
Well, and I wonder if in your mind it might be easier to disconnect the system with the people, right? The system itself needs to be dismantled and it does not need to be humanized, but the people in which enact out the system there does need to be a humanization of their existence, but there still needs to be accountability and justice and all of those kinds of things. And so when we make this distinction, because anyone that thinks that America right now in this month in this time is just because of the person in the White House is massively mistaken. And so I think that we need to be really careful too in spaces where we're talking about liberation politically, that we don't confuse a moment for, what word am I looking for? I can't think of it, but like we don't confuse the moment for the history, because it's not just this moment. It is all the moments that came before.
Yes.
And like oppressed people have been saying, like, if we would have listened, and we have, there's like multiple points in history where voices are amplified, and then you see the direct results of that amplification, and we're seeing it right now. We had voices that were amplified to look at this and put a lens on something, and so the same thing that happened before, like with Vietnam and the civil rights and every other moment in our history, or even before that in Western history, we have this like squashing of this turn back, we feel like turning back of time. It's a reaction to what just happened.
Mhm.
The system is like biting back, kind of, right? Like fighting back against the voices rising up. Um, I do want, there's something that keeps coming back to the forefront of my mind. In the beginning of the conversation, you talked about your position as, I'm trying to remember your exact words. You said as a white middle class
Mhm.
woman, your position within the structure. So like not to be the person that is oppressed, but the person that has to resist. Can you tell me exact? I can't remember exactly what you said, but
Oh yeah, no, the it's theology of resistance, which starts with me resisting myself and the narratives that I've acquired because of my um into what I have been born. So whiteness, heterosexuality, I was, upper class, like all those things come with narratives, and I have to deconstruct those. I have to deconstruct those narratives. So I have to resist those narratives, because that's how, if I don't, I will continue participating in the oppression because I'm part of the
absolutely.
oppressor group. Even though I do have one point of intersection with oppression, being a woman, it is still just one point, and we do have data at, our most recent election, what white women will do when they're scared, which is cozy on up to patriarchy, specifically
Yes.
white patriarchy, right? And that's because there isn't enough resistance um, going on with, what should I say, with my people.
Um,
There's a lot of issues there. There's also a real breakdown of community and solidarity amongst white women. We are bred to compete against each other and to see each other as the enemy because we're competing for men. And that runs so deep, and we have to fight against that tendency and urge and find more solidarity, to actually learn what solidarity is, to be uncomfortable right now without action. Because we're not going to be, you brought this up earlier, like there's a tendency to want to run into the world and be white saviors. Um, mm, I'm thinking that right now we need to sit with our anxiety and learn to become comfortable with it
yeah.
and not be reactive, but respond. And that takes a while sometimes in learning it, but being comfortable with our discomfort would be a new thing for white women to embrace. And specifically white heterosexual women.
Yeah. I want to explore this part because coming from the background that I have, it's really hard when using language like privilege or oppressed. When you say that to someone who has generationally been poor,
Mhm.
right? And we don't really understand intersections because we're just getting into the very beginning of the conversation, and they hear the news and the media, and it sparks this anger. And for a long time, I would mainly like my family or people I grew up with, I would be really kind of irritated with the fact that obviously, if you haven't had a great time being raised in America, would it not also make sense with our history that there is marginalized people that have a different but also horrible experience, and it doesn't have to take away from yours. I was always like very kind of irritated with my family until I really started to understand that the intersectionality has to come into the conversation before we can even understand oppression and all of these different kind of, the way that we're looking at the system. And it's pretty much what you said, right? Like to examine in which the ways we show up in this society and what we've experienced, and how when we understand intersectionality, we don't take away from our own experiences. They just give richness to understanding and being empathetic to other people's.
Yes. Yeah, and that's you see that arise in a lot of conversations where some people interpret the language or the discussion around how hard the oppressed have it. We think of like the Black community or the queer community, and a cishet, white guy will say, "Well, it's not like it was roses for me. I had to work really hard." That's not wrong. That's true. You probably did
Yes.
have to work hard, but also if when the system is biased towards you, it's not as hard as it could have been for other people. So there's always this validation. You never want to validate. Like my dad came from I mean, practically nothing. Like he was raised in his house in like country Minnesota had an outhouse. Like you think about going to the bathroom in the middle of winter in an outhouse in Minnesota, right? Like, he used Sears pages as toilet paper or corn cobs, right? Like this is a man who wound up growing up and, because of what generation he was born into and when he was born into and the GI Bill and getting access to college, and he worked really hard. He worked really hard, sent me and my brother to college with no debt. Okay. I'm never going to tell him he didn't work hard. Okay. He did work hard, but the system was biased towards him being able to work hard and be successful at that. Being born in the 40s means that you came of age when you were able to buy a house and have a living wage. You know what I'm saying? Like there's certain things that we need to be able to be honest about. It's not about this group just got everything for free and this group got nothing. It's that yes, you worked hard in a system that was already biased towards you. And these people over here are doing the exact same thing you're doing, but they have to do 3 times more now to get even closer to where you are. Like the question would be to some people would be like, do you think in this economy, your success story, for instance, my dad rising from backcountry Minnesota to being working at Morgan Stanley, would you have if you were born in the 70s or 80s, do you think you'd have the same success story? You know, this drummers already shaking their head. No, I mean, I'm living it right now. Like, no, we have to work really, really hard, and to even get just middle class existence. And we're not sending our kids off to school with no debt, for sure we're not. So it's just that validation though, if you could break through, that's another way. We were going back to the idea of like that wall that's built up. Listening, 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 listening. The first 4 steps of any interaction. Listen to the pain, listen to the fear, listen to the anger, and then address those things, right? It's not always the facts that are coming out of the mouth. There's as a pastor, we're trained when someone comes up to me and says, has a question about hell, the question I hear is, am I going there? Right? This not the question. The question isn't about hell. It's, am I so bad that God can't love me? Right? Like, hear the question in the space. and hear the fear being articulated, hear the absolutely scared to death that one generation is calling another generation inherently bad.
Mm-hmm.
No, 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 that's not what we're saying. Or because I chose to parent my kids this way, somehow my mom did it all wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone does the best they can with the tools they're given. And acknowledging that not all of it's going to always be good, right?
Yeah.
Traditional parenting, we didn't spank, we don't, or corporal punishment as parents, we didn't buy into. I didn't do clean plate club. I baby wore, I co-slept, I did all the hippie stuff, cloth diapers, homemade baby food. And at times my mom saw it as a critique against her
Mm.
own upbringing. I said, no, 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 no. There's certain things that work that I'll implement my own parenting, but a lot of that stuff, because of the new science we have, a lot of that stuff has grown archaic. We need
Yeah.
to move
Which, and
on
I'm
from that.
sure what we use will also happen to us, right? Like
Yeah,
the
and that's
next.
exactly like we don't have the final say. That's the neat thing about John, the Gospel of John's articulation of the coming of the Spirit. Jesus says, I have so much to tell you, but your little brains can't handle it right now. So a spirit is coming, a paraclete is coming, and they will tell you what you need to know. And I love that. That's my translation, by the way. I always translate the paraclete with they them pronouns. Um, the spirit then is liberated to tell us in each generation what it is we need to do now. I remember one time very late at night, I was talking with my dad. There may have been cocktails involved. I don't know, won't say. And he said to me, my time is up. He wasn't being prophetic, he's still alive. He said, I did the best I could with the information I had to get this country to where I thought it needed to go. Now it's your turn. And I don't agree with most of the stuff you say, but you are doing what you feel you need to do for your country, for your kids, for your family. And it was one of those moments that like stuck with me because it was this validation of distinct difference and approach, which to this day is still very distinct and different. But it was this awareness that his time was coming to an end and my time and my brother's time was coming up, and that we were going to do the same thing he did, the best that he could, the best that we can do, that with what we have, with what we can see, and build what we need to build as we see fit. And I thought that was really neat. It was a really neat experience to have that with.
That's a really,
That's what
really beautiful conversation.
we need to. Sometimes the brown water will do that. I won't say it does it all the time, but there's um there's a point in time that we are going to have the same conversation and let go. Um, but there's the thing is for me is always that cannot emphasize it enough. Listening, 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 listening. We right now, especially as for me as a cishet white woman, I need to be listening, 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 listening. How do I participate in this moment so that I don't react and I respond?
Yeah.
But listening in those conversations, listening with those people, listening for the fear, the anger. What are they afraid of? What are they angry about?
Yeah.
Where are they scared of being judged? I think that helps to at least move conversation forward. Not always to win people over to your side or to get one for the team, but to really actually hear what someone's trying to say, I think is absolutely important and will help us in the long run um, as we go
I
along
like
here.
I like to look at it as every time I learn someone's story through their own lens, not through my own, I add a piece of that to my own story, right?
Yeah,
So within listening, I grow my own understanding of self. And in turn, that helps us weave this understanding of community. And as we wrap up the conversation, which has been wonderful, thank you, I want to kind of point out that this listening, 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 fascism does it too. It
yeah,
listens to your fears, it listens to what you have at stake, and then it gives you something that can only be given through the power that was invested in them to kind of set you free, right? To or to keep your freedom, or to whatever new promise with the big gold bow. But they do listen. Like a lot of people are surprised at the way things are playing out. And I think it comes down to the fact that we have a lot of angry people, and there was someone listening. Granted, they're not letting them find out what their own lens is. They're trying to kind of like give them one, right?
Yeah.
Thing we can all rally together with. But listening can be used, unfortunately, to do really horrible things.
It can. And can I add to what you said there? Because I think that's a really
Absolutely.
great segue. Fascism does something even more interesting than listening. It creates a problem, then it pretends to listen, then it pretends to solve. But the key component is that creation of the problem in the first place. It has to always create chaos so that it can come in and save. Now, fascism is born out of nationalism, so you have to have the percolating waters of nationalism in order to kind of move that. I almost have the image of a cyst. You have to move that up into to get full-blown fascism. You have to have nationalism. And because fascism has a leader, that the distinction between nationalism and fascism is that fascism actually has a leader component to it. Christian fascism is a different form than necessarily hardcore political fascism because hardcore political governmental fascism has a military component to it, an oppressive military, creating chaos. This is what the NSDAP did through the in the rise of the Third Reich, and then in that 15 years where Hitler sort of had the control, or maybe more like 12 years, since 1933 is when the president dies and he takes over officially, I believe. We Christian fascism is something that has been in play since the late 70s that has a leader to it. So that's what the Christian fascism thing is that it's got a leader. It's not Christ. That's a misunderstanding. It was at the time in the late 70s, it was something called the moral majority. Okay, the moral majority. And these are the people who have created the Heritage Foundation, and all of the other little people that come off of that. They're the authors behind the Conservative Manifesto that eventually becomes Project 2025, which, by the way, had a 2016 version that was given to Trump, and he followed it up to about 60%. This time around, it seems like he's adhering tighter to it. But it's all about creating and establishing this Christian conservative state. Okay, so the Christian fascism part, Dortizola, who coins the term Christo-fascism, talks about this form of fascism as a soft fascism. It's oppression that lacks a lot of that military turning in. Fascism, as I said, will always have that kind of strong arm of the military. The military becomes absolutely key in fascism because it's going to create the chaos. It's going to hear the chaos, as you said, listening, and then it's going to solve it with some sort of oppressive thing. So right now, what we're seeing is oppressive executive orders, right? With the deployment of ICE to proceed with deportations, mass deportations. That's that's a working out of some of those components. But when we talk about Christofascism, we're specifically talking about a religious component that is controlling the government, and kind of bleeding down through and kind of trying to reestablish order through control, moral control, religious control. Um, And it's insidious because that idea of listening that you brought up was so key. So it doesn't listen for your words, it listens to the silences. And then it goes into the silences and then it starts to populate the silence with its own voice. So in the 80s, you had, with the distribution of televisions and radios across the nation, the fundamentalist Christian right could get into everyone's living room, and they started talking about Christianity, but then they started talking about how the good Christian is a Republican Christian. And they were able to get into the silences. So I would say that Christo-fascism or fascism in general isn't necessarily always listening for what you're scared of, but would love to get into your silences and then provoke that fear, provoke that anger. The government is trying to, turn everyone queer.
Yeah.
If you're
So,
like it just provokes, that's what it wants to
so
do.
for me, I really see it as like that fear and anger already existed within something else. Like you said, when someone says, I'm mad because of X, or like, I think the example that you used was, am I going to hell?
Yeah.
The real question is different than what we're asking. And so for me, it the way that I see it kind of playing out is you have fear, maybe unstable economic
Mhm.
position,
Mhm.
whatever it is. You have this instability. A lot of people living through just surviving, and because we're asking, you know, maybe not asking anything, but maybe we're just fearing, then a group comes in and says, oh, actually, this is what we should be scared of.
Mhm.
This is the actual problem. And
Yes.
because you already have this predisposed fear,
Yes.
this instability, this place within your life that you
Yeah.
don't find full fulfillment, it's a lot easier to jump on the bandwagon and be like, oh yeah, actually that is the problem. And if we solve that problem, this underlying fear, anxiety that I had before is going to be fixed because we're not actually understanding the root cause of the situation, right? So, like, for example, moving through queerness, a lot of it comes from patriarchy and not being able to explore oneself, right? Like the fear that I am not enough or the fear that I am not doing something correct, right? Especially when we look at, um, well, for my parents or my grandparents' generation, the way that we reared children and what we had to do to push them out into the workforce and how we kind of conditioned generations of people, it like went hand in hand in that really like the lack of, I don't want to say the lack of like self-love, but this lack of self-understanding.
Yes. Yes.
But and I like learning about the Christo-fascism because it's not
Yes.
something I know about, and I find
Yeah.
it really interesting because what happens when the Christo-fascism, which doesn't have the militarized positioning, ends up having the militarized, like it's just
Yes.
much more complex beast at that point. It's much broader than just a figurehead coming in and pressing down power. It's a in like in the foundation of social understanding and how you move through the world too.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that has to be um, parsed when you're talking about fascism and Christo-fascism is that fascism has a clear delineated structure, and Christo-fascism is more insidious.
Mm. So
Okay,
that's even like scarier. What happens when they team up and they're like,
well, and that's what's
team
happening.
fascism. Yeah.
The White House, the White House executive order for the eradication of anti-Christian bias
Yeah.
is the beginning of that
Yeah.
clear and present threat. Historically, though, if we're going to be absolutely honest about the foundations of American political structure, they've the Puritans had their hands in whatever the Pilgrims were doing.
Yeah.
So there's never really been a clear, like the Puritans' goal where they wanted to uh, morally guide the government.
Mm.
So separation of church and state, has never really been a thing in clear cut terms, but having a whole entire faith office is a
Mm-hmm.
whole different beast, and it's going to be very problematic. It reminds me a lot of when there was a Third Reich minister of the church.
Mm.
Okay. Um,
Yeah.
it's not going to go well for those of us churches that espouse a very non-muscly, non-mask
Mm-hmm.
Jesus. You know, those of us who ascribe to no, Jesus would have advocated on behalf of the trans community. It's going to be an interesting thing to watch play out, but call your senators, call your representatives, tell them to not agree with such an order. But you said something really interesting. I know that we have to close, but Dorothy Zola in her text, Beyond Mere Obedience, or otherwise known as my favorite title, it gets reprinted as Creative Disobedience, which is
Mm.
just my favorite title. She talks about how traditional authoritarian society and structures like in the church or in the politic create this subject ruler and ruled, subject and object, and leader and the one who gives the command and the one who obeys, and this really stark binary between the one who rules and the one who is ruled, and this obedience that is demanded, that this type of obedience that is demanded of this authoritarian structure is one that is stripped of the self. And so in
Mm.
this text, she goes into detail that if we're actually going to talk about a healthy and robust understanding of what obedience is, as it is demonstrated in Christ, the person actually has to have the ability to say yes or no. They have to have a self.
Mm.
They actually have to have a self to set aside, okay, in order to enter into to be truly obedient. Now she's going to ditch the word obedience over time, but she does a really good job in that book to articulate the need for that substantiated self, it and in regards to what it looks like to actually fulfill the obligation of obedience and not
Yeah.
make obedience the end goal, but the
Mm.
task or the person that you're responding to. So I thought it was really interesting that you brought that up because, yes, fascism, nationalism, these are authoritarian structures that are going to demand just blind obedience and people
Mm-hmm.
doing things that they don't understand why they're doing them and they're just doing them because that's what expected, or they're being killed when they don't, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what fascism really wants to capitalize off of that ruler and ruled paradigm, and make you scared and afraid and in chaos. And she talks about how Jesus came and disrupted everything because he was a substantiated I.
Yeah.
I tell you, you may have heard, but I tell you. And so he threatened and upheaved the created orders, and brought in the order of the kingdom of God, or the reign of God, which is something very different than the kingdom of humanity. So, anyway, another text worth examining as we
I'll
look at being present in a world that is in chaos.
I'll have to check that out. And it does make a lot of sense too. Like if you demand blind obedience, then people who occupy spaces like queer people who are pushing it back against the gender binary,
Yes.
a lot of people that are very anti-trans right now see that exclusively by itself
Mhm.
without understanding the interconnected nature. When one starts to break down binaries, it's not just one that we're breaking down. It is
Exactly.
not just one. There was I cannot remember. It was a content creator that I saw on some platform, and they said, are you really decolonizing your mind if you're still sticking yourself in the gender binary? And I'm like, how interconnected everything is,
Yeah.
because he was right. Like, when you're looking at decolonizing your mind, it's not just one piece, it's all pieces. And that's
Yeah.
why it's so scary. That's why trans people are the first to go, right? Because if you have something that's out of the expression of the binary, and you have people that are starting to understand that fundamentally life is really a spectrum and not two boxes,
Mhm.
those are really, really revolutionarily scary people.
Yes.
and ideologies to deal with.
Yeah. And they end up liberating everyone in their wake.
Yes.
And that's why white feminism has to have intersectionality to it. Okay.
Yes,
Because
absolutely.
I want my trans sisters, like talk about liberation for so many people, right? Like
Yeah.
it's so important, like at the end of the day, as a white feminist, I need to be able to say, black, female, trans, black trans women matter, right? That's
Yes.
that's where my language has to go. That feminine has to go down there, that feminism. But yeah, it's a messy time. It's a messy time.
Well, I thank you. This is a very enriching conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed myself. Thank you, John Marc, for being on here to
Yeah.
help to support and
Yeah.
co-hosting. Is
Yeah.
there anything that like last words that you want to share, something you want to get across before we kind of wrap it up?
Um, I guess my thing right now, pastorally speaking, is take care of yourself, hydrate, rest, act when you can, and as you can. You are not alone going to save the day, right? So our tiny acts of kindness and mercy and grace and love go a long way right now. And specifically as you interpret it towards yourself. I had a friend who said to me, he's a Black scholar, a scholar of Black religion specifically. And I was saying, we were talking about rest. And I said in the group, I said, well, maybe me as a white woman, I don't really deserve any rest right now. And I should just keep going. And he looked at me and he said, Lauren, I really need my allies rested. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna go take a nap. But to be a good ally means that you are functioning on your cylinders, as many as you have. But don't underestimate the power of tiny acts locally. Um, just, within your family, within your neighborhood, set up a table and give out free cookies. Who doesn't
Mm,
need a free cookie day? I know that seems trite, but acts of human kindness are going to go so far right now. So kindness towards yourself, kindness towards others. Just take it slow, but because we have a long haul, we're going to burn out
yes,
fast if we don't take care of ourselves. So this is 4 years at least.
we just started.
What are
January
we
was
like?
the
Almost
longest year
not
I've
even.
had in a long time. So
I love all the TikToks that are like, "Welcome to January 725."
yeah.
Like, yeah,
It's
feels like
great.
it. Yeah, that's my word is take care, and I mean that. Take care of yourself, take care of your loved ones, and then take care of whatever else you can on top of that.
I love that.
Don't shut down. Don't shut down.
Amen.
I love that. And don't feel guilty about having joy.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. No, exactly.
Cultivate all of it.
Yeah, I'm in a thread with some other people in Colorado about some stuff. And I said, don't forget throughout all of these crazy days to find things that make you laugh and find things that are beautiful and
Mm.
appreciate them because the darkness is exhausting.
Hmm. Well, thank you so much
Yeah.
for joining us. And again, that was Reverend Dr. Lauren R.E. Larkin and John Marc Ormechea and me, Kelsey, your host. And thank you so much and enjoy your day.
Yay.